They were unstoppable. The Mongols, the most feared war machine the world had ever seen, had crushed every empire from the deserts of Persia to the frozen plains of Europe. No army could stand against them, until they met a nation that the world barely knew existed. In the year 1288, a fleet of 500,000 Mongol soldiers and sailors sailed into the rivers of a small kingdom called Đại Việt, modern-day Vietnam. They expected another easy conquest. What they found instead was hell on water. Within a single day, the entire Mongol navy was annihilated, burned, shattered, and swallowed by the tides of a river they didn't understand. The empire that conquered half the known world was defeated by a country barely the size of one of its provinces. No miracle saved the Vietnamese. No divine intervention. It was something far greater, the mastery of time, terrain, and human will. How could a small nation outsmart the greatest military power in history? What secret lay hidden in the muddy waters of the Bach Dang River? And what can the world today learn from that victory 7 centuries ago? This is not just a story of war. This is the moment the unstoppable met the unbreakable. This is why Vietnam defeated the Mongols. The year was 1287. The Mongol Empire, forged in blood and fire by Genghis Khan, stretched from the edge of Europe to the shores of the Pacific. It was the largest land empire in human history, a monstrous network of armies, tribute, and fear. And yet, in the far south, there remained a single tiny kingdom that refused to kneel. That kingdom was Đại Việt, ancient Vietnam. To most Mongol generals, it was an irrelevant patch of jungle and rivers, a humid frontier full of stubborn peasants. But to Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis and ruler of the Yuan dynasty in China, Đại Việt was a stain on imperial pride. He had sent armies south twice before, and twice they had been humiliated. In 1258, the Mongols first invaded with swift cavalry, expecting another easy conquest. They met fierce resistance. When they entered the capital, the people had vanished, the stores burned, and the countryside turned hostile. Disease and heat struck harder than arrows. Within weeks, the invincible horsemen retreated, chased by villagers who fought with bamboo spears. The Mongols, who crushed Persia and Russia, were forced to flee from a land of swamps and rain. They came again in 1285, led by Prince Togun, with an even greater force, over 300,000 men, supported by warships from the southern Song navy they had conquered. But history repeated itself. The Vietnamese ruler, King Tran Nhan Tong, and his top general, Trần Hưng Đạo, refused to fight head-on. They abandoned cities, lured the enemy deeper, destroyed supplies, and let hunger and heat do their work. By the time the Mongols realized they were trapped, their horses were dying, their soldiers starving, and guerrilla bands harassed them day and night. The survivors staggered north across the border, broken and humiliated once more. Kublai Khan was furious. He had spent decades building an image of divine power, the son of heaven, conqueror of continents, yet he could not subdue this tiny river kingdom. In his court at Khanbalik, modern Beijing, whispers spread, the Mongols could conquer the world, but not Đại Việt. That insult was intolerable. So in 1287, Kublai prepared a third and final campaign, the largest and most sophisticated invasion Southeast Asia had ever seen. He appointed 2 of his most experienced commanders, Prince Togun once again as overall commander, and Omar Ni to lead the naval forces. The plan was simple on paper. The navy would sail down the coast carrying food, siege engines, and reinforcements. The main army would march from Guangxi through northern Vietnam, converging on the Red River Delta. Together, they would crush Đại Việt in one decisive strike. But simplicity on paper meant nothing in the real terrain of Vietnam. The geography of defiance. To understand this war, one must first understand the land itself. Vietnam was not a place where cavalry could roam freely. It was a maze of rivers, mangrove swamps, deltas, and thick forests, a landscape that neutralized Mongol strengths. Their horses struggled in mud, their arrows warped in humidity, their armor rusted in salt air. And unlike the wide-open plains of China or Persia, here every river bend could become an ambush. The Vietnamese people had learned over centuries how to make the land fight for them. They built floating villages, dug secret canals, and used tides like weapons. Every farmer knew when the river would rise and when it would devour the banks. This wasn't just geography, it was home field intelligence. And no one understood it better than Trần Hưng Đạo, the mind of a general. Trần Hưng Đạo was not just a military leader, he was a strategist shaped by betrayal, loyalty, and duty. Born into the noble Trần family, he was both a prince and a warrior. He had seen his country humiliated by the Mongols twice, and he knew a third invasion could mean extinction. But he also knew that conventional warfare would be suicide. He had studied the Mongols, their speed, their arrogance, their dependency on supply lines. He realized that the key to defeating them was not strength, but understanding. He once told his soldiers, "If you know your enemy and you know your land, you will never be defeated." That was centuries before Sun Tzu's art of war reached Vietnam, yet the principle was the same. Trần Hưng Đạo began preparing long before the first Mongol ships appeared on the horizon. He ordered the evacuation of villages near the coast, stockpiled food deep inland, and gathered intelligence from spies along the border. He trained his navy not for open sea combat, but for river warfare, where currents, tides, and narrow channels could trap even the mightiest fleet. He also ordered the crafting of wooden stakes, each as tall as a man, their tips reinforced with iron. These would be planted underwater in secret, turning rivers into invisible minefields. To an outsider, it seemed primitive. To a strategist, it was genius. The empire marches again. In late 1287, the Mongol fleet left Chinese ports. Thousands of ships, junks, transports, supply barges filled the horizon. They carried over 500,000 men, including elite cavalry units, transported by sea. They believed victory was inevitable. After all, who could resist the Great Khan's will? When they entered Vietnamese waters, the locals vanished. Villages were empty. Granaries were burned. The Mongols took what little they found and pressed forward, but their supply fleet, commanded by the Chinese general Truong Van Ho, was ambushed and destroyed. Without it, the entire Mongol army faced starvation again. Togun didn't know this yet. He marched south, expecting to rendezvous with Omar's fleet, but as days turned to weeks, his men began to weaken. Swamps swallowed horses, rains soaked gunpowder, disease spread. What the Mongols saw as delays, Trần Hưng Đạo saw as perfect timing. By early 1288, the invaders were trapped deep in the Red River Delta, exhausted, hungry, and unaware that the tides themselves were being weaponized against them. The calm before the trap. Trần Hưng Đạo set his final plan in motion. He sent scouts to lure Omar's fleet into the Bach Dang River, a winding estuary that opened into the Gulf of Tonkin. Its tides were legendary, rising fast, falling faster, and under its murky waters lay something new. Hundreds of sharpened wooden stakes driven deep into the mud. At high tide, they were invisible. At low tide, they became a forest of death. Villagers watched in silence as soldiers hammered stake after stake into the riverbed. Each log was placed at a precise depth, measured against the rhythm of the sea. Only locals could calculate when the current would turn, how fast the water would drop, and where the ships would be forced to drift. Every detail mattered, even the wind. On the morning of the 9th of April 1288, Omar's fleet took the bait. They saw Vietnamese warships retreating up the river, small, fast, seemingly frightened. It was the same pattern they had seen in every battle before victory. The Mongols laughed, beat their drums, and pursued. But this time, it was not a retreat. It was an invitation. As the tide began to fall, the river betrayed them. The hulking Mongol ships slowed, scraped, then shuddered. The water dropped fast, revealing the hidden forest beneath. Iron-tipped stakes tore through their hulls. Panic spread, and from the mist came the sound of horns, the signal. The Vietnamese fleet turned around. The moment before history. In that instant, Trần Hưng Đạo gave his command. Fire arrows arced through the air. Oil-soaked rafts ignited. From both banks, soldiers charged, shouting the war cry, "Sát Thát!" Kill the Mongols. The river exploded in chaos, ships burning, men screaming, the tide consuming all. Omar tried to rally his men, but the current dragged them onto the stakes. The entire fleet was trapped, burning from above and impaled from below. By sunset, the mighty Mongol navy no longer existed. Thousands of corpses floated downriver, carried by the same tide they had underestimated. Omar was captured alive. Togun's land army, cut off from the sea, retreated in panic back to China, harassed all the way by Vietnamese ambushes. The lessons behind the victory. The Mongols never returned. In their chronicles, the campaign was barely mentioned, a quiet shame. But in Vietnam, the Battle of Bach Dang became legend. It wasn't just a military triumph. It was proof that intelligence could defeat brutality and that a small nation could bend an empire to its knees. Trần Hưng Đạo victory was not luck, it was understanding. He had studied the enemy's habits, used the environment as an ally, and turned geography into a weapon. His tactics were centuries ahead of their time, a perfect blend of deception, timing, and terrain. Even modern strategists call Bach Dang a masterpiece of asymmetric warfare. But perhaps the most powerful lesson lies not in tactics, but in perspective. Empires fall not when they run out of soldiers, but when they stop learning from those they underestimate. And on that muddy river in 1288, the Mongols learned too late that arrogance can sink faster than any ship. The morning of April 9th, 1288, began in silence. A thick fog rolled over the Bach Dang River, cloaking the mangroves in ghostly mist. The tide was high, swallowing the hidden forest of wooden stakes below. From the north, the sound of drums echoed across the water. The Mongol fleet, stretching for miles, moving like a wall of steel and wood. Hundreds of ships advanced in perfect formation, their banners snapping in the wind, their commanders certain of victory. They had chased the Vietnamese upriver for days, mocking their retreat. To Omar, the Mongol admiral, it was a familiar pattern, the enemy fleeing, the Mongols pursuing, the inevitable triumph. He didn't know that every meter he sailed brought him closer to a death trap that had been engineered with mathematical precision. Hidden beyond the next bend waited Trần Hưng Đạo, calm, watchful, and silent. He knew this river like he knew his own breath. He had memorized the rhythm of the tide, the speed of the current, the exact moment the sea would turn against his enemy. And now, the time was almost right. The bait and the chase. At dawn, small Vietnamese boats appeared downstream. They fired a few arrows, taunting the Mongols, then turned and fled deeper into the channel. Omar laughed. His lieutenants urged pursuit. The Mongol drums thundered, oars crashed against the water. The great fleet surged forward into the narrowest stretch of the Bach Dang. On the riverbanks, peasants and soldiers hid among the reeds, holding their breath. From their eyes, you could see both fear and faith. They had seen the stakes driven into the riverbed with their own hands. Now they waited to see if the general's prediction would come true. Hours passed, the sun climbed higher. The Vietnamese fleet disappeared from sight, vanishing into the haze. Omar ordered his ships to press on deeper and deeper, until suddenly the river opened wide before them. He thought the enemy had nowhere left to run. He was wrong. The turning of the tide. Around noon, the first signs appeared. The water level began to drop slowly at first, then faster. The river, once full and calm, started to shrink. The Mongol ships grew sluggish. Oars scraped mud. Then came the first metallic sound, the unmistakable shriek of iron tearing through wood. The men looked overboard. What they saw froze their blood. Beneath the water, hundreds of sharpened stakes now jutted upward, glinting like the fangs of a hidden beast. The falling tide had exposed them, perfectly timed, exactly as Trần Hưng Đạo had planned. Panic rippled through the fleet. Shouts in Mongolian and Chinese overlapped. "Back! Turn around! The river is cursed!" But it was too late. The massive warships, heavy with men and supplies, couldn't maneuver. The current pushed them forward onto the stakes. Hull after hull splintered open. Ships tilted, capsized, and locked together. Men leapt into the water, only to be dragged down by armor or impaled beneath the surface. The great fleet that had once ruled Asia was now trapped, pinned like an insect on a needle. The Vietnamese counterstrike. Then, from the fog behind them, came the sound of a conch horn, deep and thunderous. It was the signal. Trần Hưng Đạo raised his sword. From both sides of the river, hundreds of hidden boats surged out of the mangroves. They moved fast, light, maneuverable, built for these waters. Flaming arrows streaked across the sky. Oil-filled rafts were pushed into the current, turning the water into a blazing inferno. The trapped Mongol ships erupted in flames. Smoke and screams filled the air. The Vietnamese archers on the banks fired volley after volley, while spearmen leapt from small boats onto burning decks. They weren't fighting for conquest. They were fighting for survival. Omar tried to rally his men, but the chaos was unstoppable. The tide, once the Mongols' ally, now turned traitor. As the water fell lower, the stakes rose higher, shredding any ship that tried to move. By afternoon, the Bach Dang River was no longer a river. It was a graveyard. Fire, steel, and water. The Mongol fleet burned under the tropical Sunday. Smoke coiled into the sky, visible for miles. The river ran red with blood and oil. Thousands of bodies drifted downstream, soldiers, horses, fragments of ships. On a single command, Trần Hưng Đạo men advanced through the wreckage, killing the survivors who resisted and rescuing those who surrendered. He had one order: capture Omar alive. By evening, they found him wounded, covered in ash, dragged from the ruins of his flagship. The once mighty admiral of the Great Khan was now a prisoner, kneeling before the general of the nation he had come to destroy. Upstream, Prince Togan, commanding the land army, heard the distant thunder and saw black smoke curling on the horizon. He realized what had happened too late. His navy was gone, his supply lines were gone. His entire campaign collapsed in a single afternoon. He ordered a retreat north, a desperate flight through mountains and jungles. Vietnamese forces harassed them every step of the way. By the time they crossed the border, the proud Mongol army had been reduced to starving fragments. The end of the invincible. When the sun finally set, the river fell silent. Only the sound of crackling wood remained. Trần Hưng Đạo stood at the shore, his armor splattered with mud and soot, his eyes fixed on the tide. He had turned nature itself into a weapon and won. It wasn't just a victory of arms, but of intellect. He had studied the tide charts, the wind, the psychology of his enemy. He didn't just fight the Mongols, he outthought them. Reports of the disaster reached Kublai Khan weeks later in Beijing. Witnesses said the Great Khan refused to believe it. How could the empire that crushed Baghdad, Moscow, and Korea be defeated by a river? But the truth could not be hidden. Omar was captured. Togan barely escaped. 500,000 men were gone. Kublai raged, but he never tried again. The empire's southern ambition ended at the waters of Bach Dang. For Vietnam, it was more than survival. It was a message to every future invader. This land may be small, but it knows how to fight. The river that remembered. Centuries later, when the tides rise and fall at Bach Dang, fishermen still claim they can see the tops of the ancient wooden stakes when the water is low, reminders of the day a nation changed history. The lesson endures. Victory does not belong to the strongest, but to those who understand their enemy, their land, and their moment in time. That day, the unstoppable met the unbreakable, and the tide of history itself turned in Vietnam's favor. When the fires died and the tide returned, the Bach Dang River was no longer a battlefield, it was a grave. Thousands of charred ships and bodies floated silently, drifting toward the sea. The once mighty banners of the Mongol Empire, the Black Horse, the Golden Falcon, were soaked in mud and blood, their glory drowned beneath the waters they thought they could command. Trần Hưng Đạo walked among the wreckage in silence. He ordered his men not to cheer, not to celebrate. He understood what had just happened, not just a victory, but the end of an empire's illusion of invincibility. The Mongols had been beaten before, but never like this by strategy, not strength, by intellect, not numbers. Omar, the captured admiral, was brought before the general. He bowed his head, unable to speak. Trần Hưng Đạo looked at him and said only one thing: "You lost, not because you were weak, but because you did not understand this land." Omar nodded. He knew it was true. The collapse of the third invasion. Word of the disaster spread fast. In the north, Prince Togun's army, still marching through rain-soaked jungles, received the news too late. Their supply ships were gone. The river that was supposed to bring them food and reinforcements had devoured their fleet instead. Desperation turned to chaos. Soldiers abandoned their posts. Horses were eaten. Discipline dissolved. Those who survived the ambushes and starvation crawled back across the border, half dead. Out of nearly 500,000 men sent south, fewer than 1 in 10 returned. It was a catastrophe on a scale the Mongols had never experienced. The same empire that once erased civilizations now found itself erased by a single battle. When the survivors reached Beijing, their faces told the story before their words did. Kublai Khan refused to hear them. He stormed out of his audience chamber, shouting that the gods themselves must have turned against him. He ordered new ships built, new troops gathered, but his advisors begged him to stop. The empire was exhausted. China groaned under the weight of endless wars. And in his heart, even the great Khan knew the South would never be conquered. The rise of a legend. For Đại Việt, the victory was more than survival, it was redemption. 3 times the Mongols had come. 3 times they had been defeated. No other nation in Asia could claim such a record. The victory of Bach Dang elevated Trần Hưng Đạo from a general into a legend. He became a symbol of unity, wisdom, and courage, a man who turned rivers into weapons and taught that the mind could triumph over might. Poets wrote of him as the saint of the nation. Historians would later compare him to Hannibal, Alexander, and Napoleon commanders who changed the art of war. Yet Trần Hưng Đạo himself remained humble. He knew that his greatest weapon had not been the stakes, or the tide, or even his army. It was the spirit of the people, the farmers, fishermen and villagers who obeyed without question, who built traps in secret, who fought to the last breath not for glory, but for home. In every stake buried beneath the river, there was a heartbeat of resistance, the message to the world. The Mongol defeat at Bach Dang sent shockwaves across Asia. For centuries, no one had truly stopped them. Not Persia, not Russia, not Korea. Only Japan and Vietnam could claim to have survived their full-scale invasions. But while Japan had relied on a divine wind, the kamikaze Vietnam relied only on human intelligence. That difference made the victory even more extraordinary. Foreign chroniclers struggled to explain it. Some called it luck. Others said the Mongols were weakened by disease and weather. But the truth, recorded in Vietnamese chronicles, was simpler. It was a victory of preparation. Every trap had been calculated, every movement timed. It was not luck, it was mastery. The defeat also marked the beginning of the Mongol Empire's slow decline. Kublai Khan's reign grew weaker, his treasury drained. The empire that once expanded endlessly now began to fracture under its own weight. In a way, the collapse had started not in the deserts of Central Asia, but in the muddy waters of a small river in Vietnam. The legacy of the river. Centuries later, when the tide retreats on the Bach Dang, fishermen still find ancient wooden stakes buried deep in the riverbed. They call them Kok Bach Dang, the fangs of the river. Each one tells the same story of a people who refused to bow and a general who turned nature into his ally. In Vietnamese memory, the battle became a sacred legend. It wasn't just about defeating an invader, it was about defining identity. To be Vietnamese, the chronicles say, is to understand when to bend and when to strike, when to retreat and when to rise. The Bach Dang taught that survival isn't about being the strongest, but about knowing the moment, the why behind victory. Even modern military historians still study Trần Hưng Đạo tactics. The concept of asymmetric warfare, where a weaker side uses intelligence and environment to defeat a stronger one, traces its roots to this river. It was, in many ways, the Vietnamese way of war, one that would echo centuries later against other empires who underestimated the same land. The echo of a lesson. Empires have long memories, but rivers remember longer. The Mongols never returned, and Đại Việt entered a golden age of stability and pride. But the lesson of Bach Dang reached beyond its time. It whispered through history to all who would listen. Arrogance blinds the conqueror. Understanding empowers the defender. Every empire that came after, from colonial powers to modern superstates, would face the same truth in this small corner of Asia. You can invade Vietnam, you can even occupy it, but you will never truly conquer it. The Battle of Bach Dang stands as a reminder that the fate of nations isn't decided by size, weapons, or numbers. It's decided by understanding. Understanding your enemy, understanding your land, and understanding the moment when history itself turns with the tide. As the last light fades over the muddy waters of the Bach Dang, the question remains, echoing across 7 centuries. Why did Vietnam defeat the Mongols? Because some victories are not written by power, but by wisdom, patience, and the will to remain free. History is often told through numbers the size of armies, the years of reign, the weight of empires, but sometimes a single day can rewrite centuries. April 9th, 1288 was one of those days. At the mouth of the Bach Dang River, a nation no one believed could stand, proved that knowledge could outlast power. The Mongols came with the confidence of conquerors. They left behind silence. And in that silence, a lesson was born, one that has outlived every empire since. Trần Hưng Đạo victory was not just military brilliance. It was philosophy in motion, a demonstration that true strength lies in understanding, not domination. He turned nature into an ally, patience into a weapon, and unity into armor. In his strategy, you can glimpse something universal, the eternal balance between arrogance and awareness, ambition and humility. The Bach Dang River still flows today, quiet but unforgotten. Its waters have long washed away the bodies and the fire, but they can't erase memory. Every tide that rises and falls carries a whisper from the past, of ships burning, soldiers screaming, and a people standing unbroken. When you look back through history, you will see this pattern again and again. Empires rise, believing they are unstoppable, and then they meet a small force that refuses to yield, guided not by might, but by understanding. That is why we study history, not to worship victory, but to ask why it happens. Because why is the question that changes everything. It is the bridge between the past and the present, between what was and what could be. And if we stop asking it, we stop learning from those who came before us. So, as the tides of the Bach Dang fade into the sea, remember, the greatest victories are not written in blood, but in wisdom. The ones who understand why are the ones who endure. This was why Vietnam defeated the Mongols, the Battle of Bach Dang 1288. If this story made you think, if it made you feel, If it reminded you that the smallest nations can leave the biggest marks, then stay with us. At WhyHistory Asia, we dive deep into the untold stories of this continent, from the rise of Japan to the fall of the Qing, from forgotten dynasties to decisive battles that shaped civilizations. Every episode, we ask the same question: why did it happen, and what can we still learn from it? Cinematic storytelling, real history, timeless lessons. Subscribe now and join us in asking the one question that defines humanity itself. Why?